Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. What I'm about to show you isn't just the story of some underground drug dens. This is the untold tale of how an entire population created their own hidden universe right under the noses of their British occupiers. Over the next few minutes, I'll take you inside these clandestine havens, introduce you to the real people who lived and breathed in these smoky chambers, and reveal how these secret spaces became the beating heart of Egyptian resistance culture. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how desperate things had become for ordinary Cairenes by the time the British took control. The year is 1882. The British have just crushed the Urabi revolt, and General Garnet Wolseley's troops march through Cairo's streets like conquerors. For the average Egyptian, life under Ottoman rule had been challenging enough, but now they faced something entirely different. Systematic colonial exploitation designed to extract every ounce of wealth from their homeland while treating them as second-class citizens in their own country. Muhammad al-Ghazawi knew this reality all too well. A skilled carpenter who once crafted intricate mashrabia screens for wealthy merchants, he now found himself competing with cheap imported goods flooding the Egyptian market. His workshop, which had employed 6 men just 5 years earlier, now stood nearly empty. The traditional crafts that had sustained generations of his family were being systematically destroyed by British economic policies designed to turn Egypt into nothing more than a cotton plantation and consumer market for Manchester textiles. Every morning, Muhammad would walk past the new British administrative buildings rising in the European Quarter, their pristine facades a stark contrast to the crumbling infrastructure in his own neighbourhood. The water systems built by the pharaohs and maintained by the Mamluks were falling apart, while British engineers focused their attention on projects that benefited the colonial economy. Raw sewage ran through streets where children played, and diseases like cholera swept through the native quarters with frightening regularity. But it wasn't just the physical conditions that crushed the spirit of people like Muhammad. The British had implemented a complex system of racial hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top, followed by other foreigners, then Turco-Circassian elites, and finally, at the very bottom, native Egyptians. A British clerk with no experience could earn more in a month than Muhammad made in a year. Egyptian professionals found themselves passed over for promotions in favour of less qualified foreigners. The message was clear. In your own homeland, you are worth less than any outsider. This is where our story really begins, because when people are pushed to their absolute limit, they don't just disappear quietly into the night. They adapt, they survive, they create their own worlds within the world that oppresses them. Ahmad ibn Tulun had been a government clerk before the British occupation, processing documents in Arabic for the Ottoman administration. Now he found himself relegated to the most menial tasks, watching as British officials made decisions about Egyptian affairs without bothering to learn a single word of Arabic. His salary had been cut by more than half, and his once respected position had become a source of daily humiliation. One evening in late 1883, as Ahmad walked home through the winding streets of Islamic Cairo, he noticed something unusual. A man he recognized from the old government offices disappeared through a doorway that Ahmad had passed hundreds of times, but never really noticed. Curious, he lingered in the shadows and watched. Over the next hour, he saw more familiar faces slip through the same entrance. A former teacher whose school had been closed, a displaced artisan, a shopkeeper struggling to compete with European merchants. The door itself was unremarkable, set into the ground floor of a traditional Mamluk-era house. Above it, wooden shutters remained permanently closed, and the only identifying mark was a small symbol carved into the stone lintel, so weathered it was barely visible. But Ahmad's curiosity had been awakened, and curiosity in desperate times can be a powerful force. 3 nights later, Ahmad gathered the courage to approach the door himself. Before he could knock, it opened silently, and a figure gestured for him to enter quickly. He found himself in a narrow corridor lit by a single oil lamp, the walls lined with colourful textiles that muffled sound. The air was thick with an unfamiliar sweet smoke that made his head feel light almost immediately. The corridor opened into a larger room that took Ahmad's breath away. The space had been transformed into something that felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Rich carpets covered every surface, and low divans lined the walls. Brass water pipes, some nearly 3 feet tall, stood like sentinels throughout the room, their ornate designs catching the flickering light of dozens of candles. But most striking of all were the people. Here were faces Ahmad recognized from his former life: government clerks, skilled craftsmen, small merchants, religious scholars who had been pushed aside by the new order. They reclined on cushions, sharing pipes and speaking in low, animated voices. Some played backgammon or chess. Others listened intently to a storyteller whose voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm. The atmosphere was unlike anything Ahmad had experienced, a mixture of melancholy and defiant joy that seemed to perfectly capture the mood of occupied Cairo. An elderly man approached Ahmad with the grace of someone who had once held real authority. This was Mahmoud Bey al-Falaki, a former administrator who had overseen tax collection for 3 provinces under the old system. Now, he served as something like a host in this hidden world, welcoming newcomers and maintaining the unspoken rules that kept the space safe. Mahmoud explained that this particular establishment, known simply as the House of Clouds to its regular visitors, was one of dozens scattered throughout Old Cairo. Each served a slightly different community, but all shared the same basic purpose: providing a refuge where Egyptian men could escape the daily humiliations of colonial life and remember what it felt like to be respected members of their own society. The hashish itself came from the finest sources, smuggled down from Lebanon or grown in hidden plots along the Nile Delta. But this wasn't just about the drug, Mahmoud emphasized. The true power of these spaces lay in what happened when men gathered together, shared their stories, and began to see their individual suffering as part of a larger pattern of injustice. As Ahmad settled onto a cushion and accepted his first pipe, he listened to conversations flowing around him like water finding its level. In one corner, 3 former soldiers discussed the weapons hidden in their neighborhoods and speculated about when the next uprising might begin. Near the storyteller, a group of displaced religious scholars debated the theological implications of resistance against occupying forces. At a backgammon board, 2 merchants quietly coordinated a boycott of British goods, planning to spread the word through networks that existed entirely outside official channels. The smoke that filled the room served multiple purposes beyond its intoxicating effects. It created a veil that softened harsh realities, allowing men to speak more freely about their dreams and fears. It slowed time, creating hours that felt stolen from the relentless pace of colonial exploitation. Most importantly, it bound the group together in shared ritual, transforming individual despair into collective defiance. But these weren't just places where men came to complain or escape. As the evening progressed, Ahmad began to understand that he had stumbled into something far more sophisticated than a simple hashish den. This was a shadow institution, a parallel social structure that had emerged to replace everything the British occupation had destroyed. When the formal courts became instruments of colonial control, disputes were settled here according to traditional customs. When the official schools began teaching curricula designed to produce compliant colonial subjects, real education continued in these smoke-filled rooms where older men passed on knowledge, skills, and cultural memory to younger generations. When the newspapers fell under censorship, news and analysis flowed through networks centered on establishments like the House of Clouds. The physical layout of these spaces had been carefully designed to serve these multiple functions. The main room where Ahmad now sat was just the beginning. Through doorways concealed behind hanging carpets, other chambers served different purposes. In one, a traditional healer treated ailments using methods the British medical establishment dismissed as superstition. In another, a calligrapher continued producing traditional manuscripts while British schools switched to European-style printing. A third room housed what could only be described as an informal bank, where men pooled resources to help members weather economic hardships or start new ventures. As Ahmad's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he began to notice details that revealed the true sophistication of this hidden world. The walls weren't simply covered with random textiles. They were lined with maps of Cairo from different eras, showing how the city had grown and changed over centuries. Between the maps hung calligraphy that wasn't just decorative, it contained coded messages about British troop movements, tax collection schedules, and other information vital to those trying to navigate or resist colonial rule. The water pipes themselves told their own story. Each one belonged to a specific regular, and the designs reflected their owner's history and status. Muhammad al-Ghazawi's pipe, which Ahmad would later learn to recognize, was crafted from wood salvaged from his demolished workshop, inlaid with geometric patterns that spoke of his carpentry skills. A former judge named Hassan al-Attar owned a pipe made from silver that had once adorned the citadel before the British stripped it of valuables to ship back to London. But perhaps most remarkable was how these men had adapted traditional Egyptian hospitality customs to serve their new reality. In the old Egypt, a man's honor was measured partly by how generously he received guests in his home. Here, that same principle operated, but the home was collective and the guests were all refugees from the same catastrophe. New arrivals like Ahmad were immediately offered the best hashish, the most comfortable cushions, and patient explanations of how this shadow society functioned. The storyteller who had captured Ahmad's attention was a man named Yusuf al-Baghdadi, whose voice carried the authority of someone who had once commanded audiences in the great mosque of Al-Azhar. Before the occupation, he had been one of Cairo's most respected religious teachers, known for his ability to weave together Quranic verses, historical anecdotes, and contemporary observations into lessons that illuminated both spiritual and worldly matters. Now, Yusuf used those same skills for a different purpose. His stories in the House of Clouds weren't just entertainment. They were vehicles for preserving and transmitting Egyptian identity in ways that couldn't be censored or controlled. He would begin with tales that seemed to be about ancient pharaohs or medieval sultans, but as the evening progressed and the hashish took effect, his narratives would gradually transform into allegories about contemporary resistance. On this particular night, Yusuf told the story of a young fisherman from a village along the Nile who discovered that foreign merchants were poisoning the river to kill the local fish, then importing their own to sell at inflated prices. The fisherman couldn't confront the merchants directly because they had the protection of corrupt officials. So instead, he learned to fish in secret places the foreigners didn't know about, sharing his catch with his neighbors and gradually building a network of resistance that eventually drove the merchants away. Everyone in the room understood that Yusuf wasn't really talking about fish. He was describing exactly what they were all doing, finding ways to survive and resist that operated outside the official systems the British controlled. The beauty of the story format was that it allowed men to discuss strategies and share information without ever stating anything directly that could be used as evidence if informers were present, and informers were always a concern. The British had recruited networks of collaborators from every level of Egyptian society, offering rewards for information about anti-colonial activities. The operators of places like the House of Clouds had developed elaborate security measures that would have impressed professional conspirators. New visitors were never admitted alone. They had to be brought by established members who vouched for them personally. The entrance procedures involved multiple checkpoints disguised as casual social interactions. The man who had gestured Ahmad inside wasn't just being polite. He was conducting a subtle interrogation to determine whether this visitor posed any threat. Once inside, conversations were structured according to unwritten rules that protected everyone involved. Direct criticism of British policies was rare. Instead, complaints were framed as nostalgia for the old days or speculation about distant places. Military information was shared through discussions of hunting techniques or horse breeding. Economic resistance was planned through conversations about traditional crafts or religious festivals. The physical space itself was designed with security in mind. Multiple exit routes led through connecting buildings, allowing rapid dispersal if authorities appeared. The rooms were arranged so that different groups could meet simultaneously without overhearing each other's conversations. Hidden compartments throughout the building stored not just hashish and pipes, but also weapons, documents, and gold that members contributed to support resistance activities. Mahmud Bey al-Falaki had perfected these systems through bitter experience. During the first year after the occupation, several similar establishments had been raided and their members imprisoned or worse. Mahmud had watched friends disappear into British detention centres, their families left destitute and afraid to ask questions about their fate. But each failed attempt had taught valuable lessons about how to operate more effectively. The survivors learned that successful resistance required patience, discipline, and above all, the ability to appear harmless to the occupying authorities. From the outside, places like the House of Clouds looked like exactly what the British expected from colonised natives: mysterious, probably unsavoury, but ultimately irrelevant to serious political affairs. This calculated invisibility extended to the choice of hashish as the central ritual substance. The British, like most Europeans of their era, viewed hashish use as evidence of Oriental decadence and moral weakness. They saw Egyptian men gathering to smoke as confirmation of their own racial superiority and the necessity of colonial control. What they completely failed to understand was that these gatherings represented one of the most sophisticated forms of political organization they faced in occupied Egypt. The drug itself played a crucial role in creating the psychological conditions necessary for effective resistance. Hashish didn't just provide escape from daily humiliations, it created a shared altered state that dissolved normal social hierarchies and allowed men from different backgrounds to interact as equals. A former government official like Mahmud could sit beside a street vendor like Rashid ibn Omar and genuinely listen to his ideas about how to organize boycotts of British goods. Rashid had developed one of the most effective resistance strategies Ahmad would encounter during his time in the House of Clouds. As a seller of traditional sweets and pastries, he had access to customers throughout Old Cairo, from wealthy merchants to day labourers. His cart was a mobile information network that connected dozens of other hashish establishments scattered across the city. Each morning, Rashid would visit his suppliers. But these weren't just transactions for sugar and flour. The baker who provided his pastry shells would whisper news about British troop movements observed near the barracks. The honey seller would share information about which Egyptian officials were cooperating too enthusiastically with the occupation. The spice merchant would report on conversations overheard in European households where he delivered supplies. By afternoon, when Rashid began his rounds through the neighbourhoods, he carried more than sweets. Coded messages were baked into specific pastries and delivered to predetermined locations. A honey cake with almonds arranged in a particular pattern might signal that a planned demonstration should be postponed. Rosewater biscuits wrapped in green paper indicated that weapons were available at a certain location. The genius of this system was its complete invisibility to the authorities. British officials saw an Egyptian street vendor selling traditional sweets, exactly what they expected to see in a colonized city. They never suspected that Rashid's cart was actually a sophisticated communications hub linking resistance cells across Cairo. During evening gatherings at the House of Clouds, Rashid would share the intelligence he had gathered, but always through the same indirect storytelling methods that Yusuf used. He might describe the eating habits of different types of birds, but his audience understood that he was actually reporting on British patrol schedules. A discussion of seasonal changes in customer preferences was really an analysis of shifting political moods in different neighborhoods. These information networks allowed the hashish establishments to serve as early warning systems for the broader community. When British authorities planned raids on suspected dissidents, word would flow through the smoke rooms hours or even days in advance. Families would have time to hide compromising materials or temporarily relocate vulnerable members. The warning system had saved Ahmad's own life within months of his first visit to the House of Clouds. His former supervisor at the government office, apparently hoping to curry favour with the new administration, had provided British officials with a list of clerks he suspected of harbouring anti-colonial sentiments. Ahmad's name was on that list. The information reached Mahmoud through a chain that demonstrated the remarkable reach of the hashish house networks. An Egyptian servant working in the British administrative compound overheard a conversation about pending arrests. That servant was the brother of a man who frequented a hashish establishment in another quarter of the city. The brother passed the information to his establishment's equivalent of Mahmoud, who sent word through Rashid's network to every connected smoke room in Cairo. By the time British soldiers arrived at Ahmad's lodging, they found only an elderly landlord who claimed his former tenant had left the city to seek work in Alexandria. In reality, Ahmad was hiding in a room behind the House of Clouds, beginning a new life as a full-time member of the resistance community that had saved him. This experience taught Ahmad something crucial about the true nature of these hashish havens. They weren't just refugees from colonial oppression. They were alternative societies that provided everything the official Egyptian government could no longer offer its people: justice, security, economic support, education, and most importantly, dignity. Men like Ahmad didn't simply vanish into these spaces and abandon the outside world. Instead, they developed what could only be described as dual lives, moving seamlessly between the humiliating daylight reality of colonial Cairo and the empowering nighttime universe of the hashish establishments. This constant transition required skills that would have impressed professional actors. During daylight hours, Ahmad learned to perfect the performance of defeated submission that British authorities expected from native Egyptians. He would lower his eyes when passing European officials, step aside deferentially when foreigners approached on narrow sidewalks, and respond to questions with the kind of broken, apologetic English that confirmed colonial stereotypes about Egyptian intellectual inferiority. But these weren't signs of genuine defeat. They were calculated survival strategies developed collectively in the smoke-filled rooms where men shared techniques for navigating the colonial maze without losing their souls. The same gathering that might spend hours discussing the theological implications of resistance would also provide practical workshops on how to appear harmless while conducting subversive activities. Salim al-Masri had become a master of this double existence. By day, he worked as a translator for British merchants, helping them negotiate contracts with Egyptian suppliers. His employers valued his apparent eagerness to please and his detailed knowledge of local business practices. What they didn't realize was that Salim was systematically sabotaging their operations through carefully orchestrated miscommunications. When a British textile importer wanted to purchase cotton at below-market prices, Salim would translate the offer accurately, but add subtle warnings in Arabic that allowed Egyptian suppliers to coordinate their responses. A phrase like, "The gentleman hopes for your cooperation," might be rendered as, "This foreigner seeks to cheat you as he has cheated others, but we must appear to negotiate seriously." The result was that British merchants found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by Egyptian suppliers, who seemed remarkably sophisticated in their bargaining strategies. These economic warfare tactics were refined and coordinated through the hashish house networks. Every evening, men like Salim would gather to share intelligence about British commercial activities and developed strategies for undermining them without triggering retaliation. The sweet smoke that filled these rooms didn't just provide psychological escape, it facilitated the kind of creative thinking necessary for asymmetric resistance. One particularly ingenious scheme emerged from a conversation between three men who had never met before arriving at the House of Clouds. Farid al-Jawhari had been a shipping clerk at Alexandria's port before losing his position to a British replacement. Khalil ibn Yusuf was a former customs inspector who now worked as a night watchman. Mustafa al-Dimashqi had operated a small import business until British trade policies made it impossible to compete. Individually, each man's knowledge was limited, but as they shared pipes and stories late into the night, they began to see how their separate pieces of information could be combined into something powerful. Farid knew the schedules and cargo manifests of British merchant ships. Khalil understood the security procedures at various warehouses. Mustafa had maintained contacts with suppliers throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Within weeks, they had established what amounted to a shadow import network that operated entirely outside British control. Goods would be unloaded from ships during Khalil's watch shifts and stored in warehouses that weren't officially connected to any registered business. Mustafa's supplier network would redistribute these goods through traditional Egyptian commercial channels, undercutting British merchants who relied on official procedures and documented transactions. The profits from these operations weren't kept by the organizers. Instead, they flowed back into the Hashish house networks to fund expansion and support members who had lost their livelihoods to colonial policies. A portion went to families whose breadwinners had been imprisoned or killed for anti-British activities. Another portion purchased weapons that were hidden throughout Old Cairo in preparation for future uprisings. But perhaps most importantly, some of the money funded what could only be described as alternative educational institutions. The British had restructured Egyptian schools to produce compliant colonial subjects, emphasizing European languages, history, and values while marginalizing traditional Islamic and Arabic learning. The Hashish establishments became centers for preserving and transmitting the knowledge that official institutions were systematically destroying. In a room behind the House of Clouds, an elderly scholar named Abu Bakr al-Suyuti conducted evening classes that would have been considered subversive by British authorities. Al-Suyuti had been one of Al-Azhar's most respected teachers before the occupation, known throughout the Islamic world for his commentaries on Islamic law and Arabic poetry. Now, he taught in whispered voices to small groups of young men who gathered after the main Hashish sessions had concluded. The curriculum was everything the British educational system avoided. Students learned classical Arabic poetry that celebrated resistance to foreign occupation. They studied Islamic legal principles that provided frameworks for legitimate rebellion against unjust rulers. They memorized historical accounts of how previous generations of Egyptians had expelled foreign invaders, from the Crusaders to the French. But Al-Suyuti's most important lessons weren't about the past, they were about the present. He taught his students to see connections between their personal suffering and broader patterns of imperial exploitation. A young man frustrated by his inability to find decent work learned that his unemployment wasn't a personal failure, but a predictable result of policies designed to keep Egyptians economically dependent. These educational sessions produced a generation of Egyptian men who understood their situation with remarkable clarity. They weren't simply victims of unfortunate circumstances, they were targets of systematic oppression designed to extract wealth from their homeland while keeping them powerless to resist. This understanding transformed individual despair into collective anger, and collective anger into organized resistance. The transformation wasn't always smooth or immediate. Many men arrived at establishments like the House of Clouds, consumed by rage that threatened to explode into counterproductive violence. The hashish helped moderate these emotions, but more importantly, the community provided channels for directing anger into effective action. Omar ibn Khalil had been one of those rage-filled newcomers. His family had operated a traditional dye works for 6 generations, creating the vibrant colors that adorned everything from prayer carpets to wedding dresses. British textile imports had destroyed the market for traditional Egyptian fabrics almost overnight, leaving Omar bankrupt and his workers destitute. When Omar first stumbled into a Hashish establishment in the leather workers' quarter, he spoke constantly about burning down British warehouses or assassinating colonial officials. The other men listened patiently to these fantasies while sharing pipes and strong coffee. But they also began the delicate process of redirecting Omar's anger into more productive channels. They introduced him to other displaced craftsmen who were developing alternative economic networks. They showed him how his knowledge of traditional dyes could be valuable in creating inks for underground publications. They gradually helped him understand that revenge was less important than survival, and survival required patience, planning, and community support. Over months of evening gatherings, Omar evolved from a bitter individual seeking personal revenge into a sophisticated operative in the broader resistance network. His dye works became a front operation for producing documents that looked official but contained false information designed to confuse British administrators. His knowledge of chemical processes proved invaluable in developing new ways to hide contraband materials from colonial authorities. But Omar's most important contribution was his ability to recruit and train other displaced craftsmen. The British economic policies that had destroyed his business were systematically dismantling traditional Egyptian industries, creating thousands of skilled workers who had lost their livelihoods. Omar developed techniques for identifying those most likely to join resistance activities and introducing them gradually to the Hashish House networks. The recruitment process was an art form that required extraordinary psychological insight. Not every displaced Egyptian was suitable for underground work. Some were too frightened by the potential consequences. Others were too eager to collaborate with the occupying authorities in hopes of recovering their losses. A few were simply too unstable to trust with sensitive information. Omar learned to identify promising candidates through careful observation of their behavior in traditional social settings. A man who continued to dress in traditional Egyptian clothing despite economic hardship demonstrated cultural pride that might translate into political resistance. Someone who refused to speak English even when it would be advantageous showed the kind of stubborn dignity that underground networks valued. But the most reliable indicator was how a man treated other Egyptians who were suffering. Those who remained generous with neighbors despite their own losses, who continued to show respect for traditional customs, who expressed their frustrations through cultural references rather than direct political statements. These were the men most likely to thrive in the Hashish House environment. The physical spaces themselves were constantly evolving to serve their community's changing needs. What had begun as simple rooms where men gathered to smoke and commiserate gradually developed into complex institutions that provided comprehensive alternatives to colonial systems. The House of Clouds expanded into 3 adjoining buildings, connected by passages that had been carved through walls during the night by skilled masons who worked in absolute silence. Each building served different functions, but all were united by the sweet smoke that drifted through connecting doorways and the shared understanding that participants were creating something unprecedented in Egyptian history. The main building remained focused on the traditional hashish sessions where men gathered to share pipes, stories, and information. But the second building housed what could only be described as a traditional Egyptian medical clinic. British colonial medicine was expensive, culturally insensitive, and often ineffective for treating conditions common among working-class Egyptians. The hashish establishment's alternative provided free treatment using methods that had been developed over centuries of practice. Hakim Abdullah ibn Sina had been trained in traditional Islamic medicine at Al-Azhar before the British restructured the curriculum to emphasize European medical theories. Now he treated patients in a room lined with hundreds of jars containing herbs, minerals, and other substances that British doctors dismissed as superstition. but that Hakim Abdullah used to achieve remarkable healing results. The treatments weren't just medical, they were psychological and spiritual. Patients received not only herbal remedies for their physical ailments, but also counseling that helped them understand how colonial stress was affecting their health. Many men discovered that their chronic headaches, stomach problems, and sleep disorders were directly related to the daily humiliations they endured under British rule. Hakim Abdullah's most important innovation was integrating hashish into his medical practice in ways that maximized both its therapeutic and resistance-building effects. Patients with severe anxiety or depression received carefully calibrated doses that helped them participate more effectively in the establishment's community activities. Men suffering from chronic pain used hashish-based treatments that allowed them to continue working in resistance operations despite their physical limitations. The third building housed workshops where displaced craftsmen continued practicing traditional skills that the British economy was systematically destroying. But these weren't just preservation efforts, they were active attempts to maintain economic independence from colonial systems. Master carpenter Mahmoud al-Najjar had lost his shop when British furniture imports made traditional Egyptian woodworking unprofitable. In the hashish establishment's workshop, he continued creating pieces that served resistance activities. Hidden compartments in apparently ordinary furniture provided secure storage for weapons, documents, and gold. Traditional mashrabiyah screens were modified with concealed viewing ports that allowed surveillance of British activities. The workshop also served as a training centre where older craftsmen passed their skills to younger men who might otherwise have been forced to seek employment with British firms. These apprenticeship programs ensured that traditional Egyptian techniques wouldn't disappear entirely, while also creating pools of skilled workers who could support resistance activities. But the most remarkable feature of these expanded hashish establishments was how they had developed their own systems of governance that operated according to traditional Egyptian principles rather than colonial impositions. Decisions were made through consensus-building processes that resembled traditional village councils, with respected elders like Mahmoud Bey al-Falaki serving as mediators rather than autocratic leaders. These governance systems had to address complex questions about resource allocation, security procedures, and strategic planning. How much of the community's limited funds should be spent on purchasing higher quality hashish versus acquiring weapons? Which British officials posed the greatest threats and deserved priority attention from intelligence networks? How should the community respond when members were arrested or killed by colonial authorities? The decision-making process combined traditional Islamic consultation principles with practical considerations unique to underground resistance. Major decisions were never made by individuals, even those with the greatest experience or authority. Instead, they emerged from lengthy discussions where every participant had opportunities to express opinions and concerns. These discussions were facilitated by the hashish sessions themselves. The drug's effects helped participants move beyond personal interests and consider broader community needs. Men who might normally compete for status or resources found themselves genuinely collaborating to solve shared problems. The altered consciousness created by hashish didn't impair judgment. It enhanced the kind of collective thinking necessary for effective resistance. But the hashish establishment's most profound achievement was cultural rather than political or economic. They had created spaces where Egyptian identity could flourish without compromise or adaptation to colonial expectations. In these rooms, men could be fully themselves, speaking Arabic without apology, practicing traditional customs without embarrassment, and dreaming of Egyptian independence without fear of punishment. This cultural preservation was active and creative, rather than merely nostalgic. The stories told in these spaces weren't just repetitions of ancient tales. They were new narratives that helped men understand their contemporary situation through traditional frameworks. The music performed wasn't simply old songs. It was evolving art that incorporated current experiences while maintaining connections to Egyptian musical traditions. Young poets like Ahmad al-Shawki found audiences in the hashish establishments that allowed them to develop distinctive voices, combining classical Arabic forms with contemporary political content. Their verses circulated through the networks, providing inspiration and solidarity for men throughout the resistance community. These poems weren't just entertainment, they were vehicles for transmitting strategic information and maintaining morale during difficult periods. The cultural creativity fostered in these spaces would eventually influence Egyptian literature, music, and art for generations. But during the occupation period, its most important function was psychological. Men who spent their days pretending to be defeated could spend their evenings remembering what it felt like to be proud Egyptians with rich cultural traditions and legitimate claims to dignity. The hashish that made all of this possible came through supply networks that were themselves remarkable examples of resistance organization. The highest quality material was grown in hidden plots throughout the Nile Delta by farmers who had developed sophisticated techniques for concealing their crops from British agricultural inspectors. These farmers weren't simply motivated by profit, they understood that their products served crucial political functions and took extraordinary risks to maintain steady supplies. Transportation from rural growing areas to urban consumption centers required elaborate security measures. The hashish traveled hidden in shipments of legitimate agricultural products, concealed in specially constructed compartments that could only be detected through careful inspection. Drivers, warehouse workers, and dock laborers throughout the supply chain were all members of the resistance networks, ensuring that the valuable cargo reached its destinations safely. But the most remarkable aspect of the hashish supply system was how it had been integrated with other resistance activities to create comprehensive support networks for the anti-colonial movement. The same routes used to transport drugs also carried weapons, intelligence, and personnel. The same safe houses that stored hashish also sheltered fugitives from British authorities. The same trusted individuals who handled drug transactions also managed financial transfers that funded resistance operations throughout Egypt. By 1885, the hashish establishment networks had evolved into something that would have astonished their founders. What began as simple refugees for displaced men had become a parallel civilization operating within the heart of occupied Cairo, complete with its own economy, governance, culture, and military capabilities that remained completely invisible to British authorities. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the establishment known as the Garden of Sorrows, located beneath a traditional hammam in the Gamaliya district. Unlike the House of Clouds, which served primarily displaced government workers and craftsmen, the Garden of Sorrows had become the unofficial headquarters for Cairo's most dangerous resistance cell, a group that called itself the Brotherhood of the Crescent Moon. Yusuf al-Andalusi had been a mathematics teacher at one of Cairo's prestigious schools before the British restructured the curriculum to eliminate subjects they considered irrelevant to colonial administration. His expertise in geometric calculations and architectural principles made him invaluable to the Brotherhood's most ambitious project, creating a network of underground tunnels connecting hashish establishments throughout Old Cairo. The tunnel system represented years of patient, invisible labor. Working only during the deepest hours of night, teams of skilled masons and excavators had carved passages through the foundations of medieval buildings, following routes that avoided main streets where British patrols might detect unusual activity. The tunnels weren't just transportation routes, they were designed as defensive positions that could be used to resist British raids or evacuate personnel during emergencies. Yusuf's mathematical skills had been crucial in planning tunnel routes that remained structurally sound while avoiding detection. He calculated load-bearing requirements for passages carved beneath centuries-old foundations, determined optimal angles for ventilation shafts that emerged in seemingly random locations throughout the city, and designed drainage systems that prevented flooding during the annual Nile inundation. But the tunnels served purposes beyond mere logistics. They had become pilgrimage routes for men seeking to understand the full scope of the resistance network. A newcomer to the movement might begin his journey at a modest hashish room in his own neighborhood, but as his commitment deepened, he would be invited to travel through the underground passages to visit other establishments, each representing a different aspect of the anti-colonial struggle. The journey itself was transformative. Moving through narrow stone passages, lit only by occasional oil lamps, breathing air thick with centuries of history, men experienced a profound connection to the generations of Egyptians who had resisted foreign occupation. The tunnels weren't just practical infrastructure, they were sacred spaces where contemporary resistance merged with ancient traditions of defiance. Ahmad ibn Tulun made this underground pilgrimage during his third year in the movement. His guide was Salim al-Baghdadi, a former court clerk who had become one of the Brotherhood's most trusted operatives. As they moved through passages that connected 7 different hashish establishments, Salim explained how each location served specific functions in the broader resistance network. Their first stop was the Workshop of Whispers, located beneath a traditional brass foundry. Here, skilled metalworkers created weapons that appeared to be decorative objects, but could be quickly converted for combat use. Traditional coffee pots contained hidden blades. Ornamental brass trays could be assembled into shields. Decorative lampstands concealed components for firearms that had been smuggled piece by piece from Ottoman territories. The workshop's master craftsman, Mahmoud ibn Hakim, had developed techniques for creating weapons that passed casual inspection by British authorities while remaining fully functional for resistance purposes. His masterpiece was a series of traditional incense burners that contained all the components necessary for manufacturing gunpowder, disguised as religious artifacts that no colonial official would dare examine closely. But Mahmoud's most important innovation wasn't technological, it was organizational. He had established a training program that taught traditional metalworking skills to young men who might otherwise have been forced to seek employment in British-owned factories. These apprentices learned not just how to work with brass and iron, but how to think strategically about resistance activities and maintain absolute secrecy about their involvement. The second stop on Ahmad's underground journey was the Archive of Sorrows, a vast chamber carved from the foundations of a medieval madrasa. Here, scribes working by candlelight maintained detailed records of British activities, Egyptian resistance operations, and the personal histories of movement members. These weren't simply administrative documents, they were the collective memory of occupied Egypt, preserved for future generations who would need to understand how their ancestors had survived the colonial period. The head archivist, Abu Bakr al-Dimashqi, had been the chief librarian at Al-Azhar before British educational reforms eliminated most traditional Islamic texts from the curriculum. Now he supervised a project that was simultaneously preserving Egyptian cultural heritage and documenting colonial crimes for eventual prosecution when independence was achieved. The archives contained thousands of documents written in various codes that had been developed specifically for resistance communications. Some used traditional Arabic calligraphy techniques that concealed messages within apparently decorative text. Others employed numerical systems based on Quranic verses that would be meaningless to British cryptographers unfamiliar with Islamic scholarship. The most sophisticated codes used astronomical calculations that required advanced mathematical knowledge to decipher, but the archive's most valuable contents weren't coded documents. They were detailed biographical records of every British official, Egyptian collaborator, and resistance member in Cairo. These files contained information that would have astounded intelligence professionals. Personal habits, financial vulnerabilities, family relationships, and psychological profiles that could be used to predict behavior or identify recruitment opportunities. The biographical files revealed the extraordinary reach of the hashish establishment networks. Information flowed from Egyptian servants in British households, clerks in colonial offices, and merchants who dealt with European customers. Even Egyptian officials who appeared to be enthusiastic collaborators were often secretly feeding intelligence to the resistance through channels that terminated in the smoke-filled rooms where men gathered each evening. Ahmad learned that his own former supervisor, the man who had provided his name to British authorities, was actually a double agent who had been feeding false information to the colonial administration for over 2 years. The supervisor's apparent betrayal of Ahmad had been carefully orchestrated to establish his credibility with British officials while protecting more valuable intelligence sources within the government bureaucracy. The third stop was the most remarkable, the Temple of Dreams, located in chambers that had once housed a medieval Sufi lodge. Here, hashish use had evolved beyond simple intoxication into sophisticated spiritual practices that combined traditional Islamic mysticism with contemporary resistance activities. The men who gathered in these chambers weren't just seeking escape from colonial oppression, they were pursuing altered states of consciousness that enhanced their effectiveness as revolutionaries. The temple's spiritual guide was Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, a descendant of the famous medieval mystic whose works were still studied throughout the Islamic world. Sheikh Muhammad had developed meditation techniques that used hashish to achieve states of heightened awareness and strategic insight that proved invaluable for resistance planning. During these sessions, participants would enter trance-like states where they could visualize British defensive positions, predict colonial reactions to various resistance strategies, and coordinate complex operations through what appeared to be mystical communion, but was actually sophisticated psychological conditioning, enhanced by the drug's effects. The Sheikh had trained a core group of disciples who served as spiritual advisors throughout the hashish establishment networks. These men weren't just religious teachers, they were psychological warfare specialists who helped resistance members maintain mental equilibrium while conducting dangerous operations. They provided techniques for managing fear, anger, and despair that might otherwise compromise operational security or personal effectiveness. But the temple's most important function was strategic planning. During extended hashish sessions that could last for days, the movement's most experienced leaders would gather to analyze intelligence, evaluate options, and develop long-term strategies for achieving Egyptian independence. The altered consciousness produced by the drug helped them think beyond conventional limitations and develop innovative approaches to seemingly impossible challenges. These planning sessions had produced some of the resistance movement's most successful operations. The boycott campaigns that had damaged British commercial interests throughout Egypt originated in visions experienced during temple sessions. The infiltration networks that had penetrated every level of colonial administration were designed during drug-enhanced strategic discussions. Even the tunnel system that now connected resistance sites throughout Cairo had first been conceived during a hashish-induced meditation on the nature of hidden power. The fourth stop on Ahmad's journey was the Academy of Shadows, where former Egyptian military officers conducted training programs for resistance fighters. These weren't simple weapons instruction sessions. They were comprehensive courses in guerrilla warfare, intelligence gathering, and psychological operations adapted specifically for urban resistance against a technologically superior occupying force. The Academy's commander was Colonel Mustafa Kamil, who had served with distinction in the Egyptian army before the British disbanded most native units following the Arabi Revolt. Colonel Kamil had studied European military techniques extensively, but he had also learned from traditional Egyptian methods of warfare that dated back to the Pharaonic period. His training program combined modern military science with ancient Egyptian strategic principles that emphasized patience, deception, and the use of environmental advantages. Students learned how to move invisibly through Cairo's medieval street system, how to gather intelligence without arousing suspicion, and how to strike at British targets while avoiding retaliation against Egyptian civilians. But Colonel Kamil's most innovative contribution was developing psychological warfare techniques specifically designed to exploit British racial prejudices. He taught his students to use colonial stereotypes as camouflage, appearing to embody exactly what British authorities expected from native Egyptians, while actually conducting sophisticated military operations. The training included elaborate role-playing exercises where resistance members practiced interacting with British officials while concealing their true capabilities and intentions. Students learned to speak broken English convincingly, to display apparent ignorance of modern technology, and to demonstrate the kind of servile behavior that made colonial administrators feel superior and secure. These deception skills had proven devastatingly effective in actual operations. British officials consistently underestimated the capabilities of Egyptian resistance members who appeared to conform to colonial stereotypes, making them vulnerable to intelligence gathering and sabotage activities that more obviously competent operatives could never have accomplished. The fifth establishment on Ahmad's underground tour was the Mint of Sorrows, where financial operations supporting the resistance movement were conducted with sophistication that rivaled legitimate banking institutions. The Mint's operations were supervised by Hassan Bey al-Bankawi, who had managed investments for wealthy Egyptian families before British economic policies destroyed most traditional financial networks. Hassan had developed alternative banking systems that allowed the resistance movement to accumulate substantial resources while remaining completely invisible to colonial financial oversight. These systems combined traditional Islamic banking principles with innovative techniques for moving money across borders and converting currencies without leaving documentary traces. The Mint's most important function was laundering profits from resistance economic activities into forms that could be used for purchasing weapons, bribing officials, and supporting the families of imprisoned or killed resistance members. Money flowed through networks of legitimate businesses that had been secretly purchased or infiltrated by movement members, emerging as untraceable funds available for operational use. But the Mint also served as the resistance movement's central bank, providing loans and financial services to Egyptian merchants and craftsmen who refused to deal with British-controlled institutions. These services weren't just economic support, they were forms of political warfare that gradually reduced Egyptian dependence on colonial financial systems. The financial networks centered at the Mint had become so sophisticated that they were actually undermining British monetary policy throughout Egypt. By providing alternative currency exchange services and credit arrangements, the resistance movement was creating parallel economic systems that functioned according to traditional Egyptian principles rather than colonial extraction models. The sixth stop was the Observatory of Secrets, located in chambers carved from the foundations of a medieval astronomical observatory. Here, the resistance movement's intelligence operations were coordinated by men who had transformed traditional Islamic scholarship into modern espionage techniques. The observatory's master spy was Ahmad al-Falaki, whose family had served as court astronomers for centuries before the British eliminated most traditional advisory positions. Ahmad had adapted his ancestors' skills in celestial observation and mathematical calculation to the requirements of intelligence analysis and strategic planning. Using techniques derived from traditional Islamic astronomy, Ahmad had developed systems for predicting British behavior, analyzing colonial vulnerabilities, and coordinating resistance operations across vast geographical areas. His methods combined careful observation, mathematical analysis, and intuitive insights enhanced by Hashish-induced altered consciousness. The observatory maintained detailed maps of British defensive positions, patrol schedules, and communication networks throughout Egypt. These weren't simply military intelligence documents, they were comprehensive analyses of colonial power structures that revealed weaknesses and opportunities invisible to conventional observation. Ahmad's most remarkable achievement was developing predictive models that allowed the resistance movement to anticipate British reactions to various resistance activities. By analysing patterns in colonial responses to previous incidents, he could forecast how authorities would likely respond to future operations, allowing resistance planners to prepare countermeasures in advance. The seventh and final stop was the most sacred space in the entire network, the Sanctuary of Martyrs, where the resistance movement honoured members who had been killed or permanently disappeared by British authorities. This wasn't simply a memorial, It was an active spiritual center that provided psychological and religious support for men engaged in activities that could result in their own deaths. The sanctuary's keeper was Imam Yusuf al-Shahid, whose own son had been executed by British authorities for participating in anti-colonial demonstrations. Imam Yusuf had transformed his personal grief into spiritual guidance that helped other resistance members cope with the constant threat of death, while maintaining their commitment to the cause. The sanctuary contained personal effects of martyred resistance members, including pipes, prayer beads, and manuscripts that had become sacred relics for the living fighters. These objects weren't just memorabilia, they were spiritual tools that connected contemporary resistance members with the sacrifices of their predecessors. But the sanctuary's most important function was providing religious justification for resistance activities that might otherwise conflict with Islamic teachings about violence and obedience to authority. Imam Yusuf had developed theological arguments that defined resistance against British occupation as religious duty rather than political choice. These theological positions weren't simply convenient rationalization. They were sophisticated religious scholarship that drew on centuries of Islamic legal tradition regarding resistance to unjust rulers. The Imam's arguments provided spiritual foundation for resistance activities while establishing ethical boundaries that prevented the movement from descending into mindless violence. As Ahmad completed his underground pilgrimage, he understood that he had experienced something unprecedented in Egyptian history. The Hashish establishments weren't just places where displaced men gathered to smoke and complain about their circumstances. They were the institutional foundation of a shadow society that provided comprehensive alternatives to every aspect of colonial rule. The journey through the tunnels had revealed the extraordinary scope of what desperate men could accomplish when they combined traditional Egyptian wisdom with innovative responses to contemporary challenges. These weren't primitive rebels hiding in caves. They were sophisticated revolutionaries who had created parallel institutions that functioned more effectively than the official systems imposed by their occupiers. But Ahmad also understood that this shadow society existed in constant danger of discovery and destruction. Every night that men gathered in these spaces, every operation conducted through these networks, every act of resistance coordinated through these channels, represented enormous risks taken by ordinary Egyptians who had decided that dignity was worth more than safety. The hashish that made all of this possible wasn't just a drug that provided temporary escape from colonial oppression. It was a sacrament that bound men together in shared commitment to Egyptian independence, a spiritual tool that enhanced their effectiveness as revolutionaries, and a practical substance that facilitated the kinds of discussions and planning necessary for sophisticated resistance operations. As Ahmad returned through the tunnels to the House of Clouds, where his journey had begun, he carried with him a transformed understanding of his own role in the resistance movement. He was no longer simply a displaced government clerk seeking refuge from colonial humiliation. He was a member of a revolutionary community that had created its own world within the world of their oppressors. The sweet smoke that filled these chambers each evening wasn't just hashish vapor. It was the breath of Egyptian independence, inhaled by men who had refused to accept defeat and exhaled as dreams of freedom that would eventually transform their occupied homeland into a sovereign nation once again. But the most remarkable aspect of this shadow society was how it had managed to remain completely invisible to the British authorities who lived and worked just streets away from its most important installations. Colonial officials walked daily past entrances to establishments where their overthrow was being planned, never suspecting that the apparently defeated Egyptians they encountered on the streets were actually members of sophisticated resistance networks. This invisibility wasn't accidental. It was the product of careful planning and disciplined execution by men who understood that their survival depended on appearing to be exactly what their oppressors expected them to be. The hashish establishment succeeded because they provided spaces where Egyptians could be themselves while maintaining perfect disguises in their interactions with the colonial system. The psychological strain of this double existence was enormous, but the community support provided in these spaces made it bearable. Men who spent their days enduring humiliation and suppressing their anger could spend their evenings expressing their true feelings and working actively toward the liberation of their homeland. The success of these establishments in remaining hidden from British authorities revealed something profound about the nature of colonial blindness. Lord Cromer himself, the British Consul General who effectively ruled Egypt, lived in a mansion less than half a mile from 3 major hashish establishments. His daily carriage rides to the British residency took him past doorways where Egyptian independence was being planned in exquisite detail. Yet in his voluminous reports to London, he described Egyptian society as politically passive, culturally stagnant, and incapable of organized resistance. This wasn't simple oversight. It was the predictable result of colonial arrogance that prevented British officials from recognizing the intelligence and capabilities of the people they ruled. When Cromer observed Egyptians gathering in traditional coffee houses, he saw confirmation of Oriental laziness. When his subordinates reported on men smoking water pipes in old Cairo's alleyways, they documented evidence of native degeneracy. The possibility that these gatherings might represent sophisticated political organization never occurred to them. Captain James Morrison of the Cairo police learned this lesson in the most humiliating way possible. Morrison had been tasked with investigating reports of anti-British sentiment in the native quarters, and he approached the assignment with typical colonial confidence. A veteran of service in India, Morrison believed his experience with Oriental peoples had prepared him for any deception Egyptian subjects might attempt. Morrison's investigation began with what he considered a clever stratagem. Disguising himself in traditional Egyptian dress, he planned to infiltrate native gatherings and observe seditious activities firsthand. His Arabic was limited but functional, and he was convinced that his disguise would allow him to move undetected through Cairo's Egyptian neighborhoods. The reality proved somewhat different. Morrison's first attempt to enter a hashish establishment ended before he reached the door. The man who served as doorkeeper took one look at the supposed Egyptian approaching and immediately recognized him as a European pretending to be native. Morrison's skin was too pale for someone who worked outdoors, his gait too confident for someone accustomed to colonial subordination, his clothing too new and precisely arranged for someone of modest means. Rather than turning Morrison away immediately, the doorkeeper made a decision that revealed the sophisticated psychological warfare capabilities of the resistance networks. He welcomed the disguised British officer warmly, ushered him inside, and made sure he was treated to an evening of exactly what British authorities expected to find in such establishments: seemingly aimless conversation, excessive drug consumption, and behavior that confirmed every colonial stereotype about Egyptian moral weakness. Morrison spent 3 hours in what he believed was successful infiltration, carefully noting details he planned to include in his intelligence report. He observed men smoking hashish while discussing trivial matters like family problems, business difficulties, and neighborhood gossip. He witnessed what appeared to be typical Oriental lethargy and lack of political consciousness. Most importantly, he heard no discussions of anti-British activities or resistance planning. What Morrison didn't realize was that he had been identified as a British spy within minutes of his arrival, and everything he witnessed was an elaborate performance designed to reinforce his preconceptions, while revealing nothing of value about actual resistance activities. The men he observed weren't regular establishment members. They were actors recruited specifically to deceive British infiltrators. The conversations he overheard had been carefully scripted to provide believable but meaningless intelligence. While Morrison was being entertained in the main room with this theatrical display, the establishment's actual members were conducting their evening's business in hidden chambers he never suspected existed. Plans were being finalized for a series of coordinated strikes against British shipping interests. Intelligence was being analyzed regarding security vulnerabilities at colonial administrative buildings. Training was being provided for new resistance recruits who would soon begin operations against British economic targets. Morrison's subsequent report to his superiors became a classic example of how colonial intelligence services consistently underestimated Egyptian capabilities. He described the Hashish establishment as a gathering place for degraded natives whose political consciousness was minimal and whose organizational abilities were virtually non-existent. He recommended that such establishments be monitored, but not suppressed, since they served the useful function of keeping potentially troublesome Egyptians occupied with harmless vices. This report was filed alongside hundreds of similar documents that painted a picture of Egyptian society that bore no resemblance to reality. British intelligence files from this period read like collections of colonial fantasy, describing a population that was exactly what imperial administrators wanted them to be: passive, disorganized, and incapable of effective resistance. The disconnect between British perceptions and Egyptian realities was perhaps most evident in the case of Rashid al-Tunsi, who had become one of the resistance movement's most effective operatives while maintaining a public persona that perfectly embodied colonial stereotypes about native Egyptians. Rashid worked as a dragoman for British tourists, guiding them through Cairo's monuments while providing commentary that combined historical information with entertaining stories. His clients invariably described him in letters home as a charming example of Egyptian backwardness, superstitious, childlike, and utterly devoted to serving European visitors. What these tourists never suspected was that their delightful guide was actually conducting sophisticated intelligence operations during every tour. Rashid's access to British visitors allowed him to gather information about colonial policies, economic plans, and military activities that proved invaluable to resistance planners. His apparent simplicity was a carefully crafted disguise that made even the most security-conscious British officials comfortable discussing sensitive matters in his presence. Rashid's most successful intelligence coup involved a group of British engineers who were surveying potential sites for new military installations around Cairo. During a week-long tour of ancient monuments, the engineers discussed their work openly in front of their guide, assuming that his limited English and obvious intellectual limitations made him incapable of understanding the significance of their conversations. In reality, Rashid's English was nearly flawless, and his understanding of military engineering was sophisticated enough to recognize the strategic implications of the proposed installations. By the time the British survey team completed their work, detailed plans of their proposed fortifications were already being analyzed in the Hashish establishments, and countermeasures were being developed to neutralize the military advantages these installations were intended to provide. But Rashid's intelligence work was only part of his contribution to the resistance movement. His real genius lay in his ability to use tourist interactions to spread disinformation that would eventually reach British policymakers in London. During conversations with visitors who he identified as having connections to British political or military circles, Rashid would share carefully crafted stories about Egyptian attitudes and capabilities. These stories invariably reinforced British preconceptions while providing false information about resistance activities. Rashid would describe Egyptian political consciousness as limited to complaints about tax policies. He would characterize anti-British sentiment as confined to a few religious fanatics with no popular support. He would portray Egyptian organizational capabilities as hopelessly primitive and ineffective. British visitors would return home and repeat these observations in social settings where they reached the ears of officials responsible for Egyptian policy. The accumulated effect of hundreds of such conversations was to create a false impression of Egyptian society that made British authorities consistently underestimate the threats they faced from resistance activities. This disinformation campaign was coordinated through the Hashish establishment networks, with the same sophistication that marked all their operations. Intelligence about visiting British officials would be gathered from hotel servants, carriage drivers, and shopkeepers who dealt with European customers. This information would be analysed to identify visitors who might serve as effective conduits for spreading false intelligence back to Britain. Operatives like Rashid would then be briefed on what information to share with specific visitors to achieve maximum strategic impact. The entire process was managed with attention to detail that would have impressed professional intelligence services, yet it remained completely invisible to the British authorities, who were its primary targets. The psychological sophistication of these operations reflected the extraordinary intellectual capabilities that colonial authorities consistently failed to recognize in their Egyptian subjects. Men like Abu Hakim al-Dimashqi, who managed information warfare activities from a Hashish establishment in the Tentmaker's Bazaar, possessed analytical skills that rivaled those of European intelligence professionals. Abu Hakim had been educated at Al-Azhar in traditional Islamic scholarship, but his interests had always extended beyond religious studies to include mathematics, natural philosophy, and what would now be called psychology. Before the British occupation, he had served as an advisor to wealthy merchants who needed to assess the reliability and motivations of their business partners. Now he applied these same analytical techniques to understanding and manipulating British colonial psychology. Abu Hakim's workshop in the Tentmaker's Bazaar appeared to be exactly what British officials expected, a traditional Egyptian handicraft operation where skilled artisans created colourful tents and banners for local celebrations. Visitors would observe men working with traditional tools to produce traditional products using methods that seemed to have remained unchanged for centuries. What they didn't see was that the apparently decorative patterns being sewn into these textiles contained coded messages that were distributed throughout the resistance network. A wedding tent delivered to a family in distant Giza might contain intelligence about British troop movements embedded in its geometric designs. A ceremonial banner created for a religious festival could carry detailed financial information needed for coordinating economic warfare activities. But Abu Hakim's most important work wasn't the production of coded textiles. It was his systematic study of British colonial psychology and his development of strategies for exploiting the weaknesses he identified. Through careful observation of British behaviour patterns, he had developed psychological profiles of key colonial officials that revealed their vulnerabilities to various forms of manipulation. Lord Cromer, for example, was particularly susceptible to information that confirmed his theories about Oriental despotism and Egyptian political incapacity. Intelligence operatives learned to frame their disinformation in ways that reinforced Cromer's intellectual prejudices, making him more likely to accept false reports and base policy decisions on inaccurate assessments of Egyptian capabilities. Captain Morrison and other security officials were vulnerable to different psychological weaknesses. Their professional pride made them reluctant to admit that they had been deceived by supposedly inferior native subjects, so they tended to rationalize obvious intelligence failures, rather than acknowledging that their understanding of Egyptian society might be fundamentally flawed. These psychological insights were shared throughout the Hashish establishment networks and used to train operatives in techniques for managing interactions with British officials. Men learned to present themselves in ways that triggered specific psychological responses in their colonial supervisors, making those officials more likely to reveal sensitive information or make strategically disadvantageous decisions. The training programs conducted in these establishments were remarkable for their sophistication and their complete invisibility to British observers. What appeared to be traditional Egyptian social gatherings were actually intensive educational experiences that transformed ordinary men into highly effective intelligence operatives and resistance fighters. Mustafa ibn Ahmad had been a mathematics teacher in a provincial school before British educational reforms eliminated most advanced subjects from the native curriculum. Unemployed and bitter, he had initially approached the Hashish establishments seeking nothing more than temporary escape from his frustrations. What he found instead was an opportunity to use his educational skills in service of Egyptian independence. Mustafa became one of the movement's most effective trainers, developing curricula that taught resistance techniques while appearing to be traditional Islamic education or cultural preservation activities. His mathematics lessons, conducted in the back rooms of Hashish establishments, were actually courses in cryptography, strategic planning, and operational security, disguised as traditional studies in Islamic geometry and astronomy. Students learned to calculate the trajectories needed for throwing bombs by studying the geometric principles underlying traditional Islamic architectural decoration. They mastered techniques for creating and breaking codes by analyzing the mathematical relationships found in Quranic verse structures. They developed skills in strategic planning by studying historical accounts of how medieval Islamic armies had defeated technologically superior enemies. But Mustafa's most important contribution was his ability to identify and develop the natural talents of individual resistance members. Through careful observation during training sessions, he could recognize men who possessed exceptional capabilities for specific types of resistance work. Someone with unusual manual dexterity might be directed toward weapons manufacturing or sabotage operations. A man with exceptional memory could be trained for intelligence gathering or message-carrying responsibilities. The training programs weren't limited to technical skills. They also included extensive psychological conditioning designed to help resistance members maintain operational security while living double lives under colonial rule. Men learned techniques for managing stress, controlling fear, and maintaining cover identities that would protect them during interactions with British authorities. These psychological training methods drew heavily on traditional Islamic mystical practices that had been adapted for contemporary resistance purposes. Students learned meditation techniques that helped them remain calm during dangerous operations. They practiced mental exercises that enhanced their ability to remember complex information without written records. They developed spiritual disciplines that sustained their commitment to the cause, despite the constant threat of imprisonment or death. The most advanced students received training in what could only be described as psychological warfare techniques designed specifically for use against colonial authorities. They learned to read British body language and vocal patterns to determine when officials were lying or concealing information. They mastered techniques for subtly influencing British decision-making through carefully crafted suggestions and manipulative conversations. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to maintain their sense of Egyptian identity and dignity while appearing to conform to colonial expectations. This was the most difficult skill to master, requiring exceptional psychological strength to endure daily humiliations while secretly working toward the liberation of their homeland. The success of these training programs was evident in the quality of operatives they produced. By the mid-1880s, the resistance movement had developed human resources that were qualitatively superior to anything the British intelligence services could deploy against them. Egyptian operatives consistently outperformed their British counterparts in intelligence gathering, operational planning, and strategic thinking. This training methods combined with the motivational advantages that came from fighting superiority wasn't accidental. It was the predictable result of superior for one's own homeland rather than serving an imperial system. Egyptian resistance members were defending their families, their culture, and their future, while British colonial officials were simply pursuing career advancement in a foreign posting. The motivational differences were particularly evident in the willingness of Egyptian operatives to take extraordinary risks for their cause. While British officials prioritized their personal safety and career prospects, Egyptian resistance members regularly accepted assignments that offered minimal chances of survival but maximum potential for damaging colonial interests. Ahmad ibn Yusuf exemplified this spirit of sacrifice. A former postal clerk who had lost his position when the British reorganized communication services to favor European personnel, Ahmad had become one of the movement's most daring saboteurs. His speciality was infiltrating British facilities to plant explosives or gather intelligence, operations that required exceptional courage and technical skill. Ahmad's most successful operation involved infiltrating the Central Telegraph Office that connected British administrators in Cairo with their superiors in London. Disguised as a maintenance worker, he spent 3 weeks mapping the facility's security procedures and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited for future sabotage operations. The intelligence Ahmad gathered revealed that British communications security was far weaker than colonial officials realized. Most messages were transmitted without encryption, making them vulnerable to interception by anyone with access to telegraph equipment. The physical security of key facilities relied primarily on Egyptian guards, who were poorly paid and inadequately supervised, creating opportunities for infiltration and sabotage. But Ahmad's most valuable discovery was that British officials routinely discussed sensitive matters over telegraph lines they assumed were secure. Conversations about military deployments, financial policies, and intelligence operations were transmitted in clear text that could be intercepted and analyzed by resistance operatives with appropriate technical capabilities. This intelligence led to one of the resistance movement's most ambitious projects: the establishment of a parallel communications network that allowed them to monitor British telegraph traffic while coordinating their own operations without detection. The technical challenges were enormous, but the potential advantages justified the investment of resources and personnel. The communications project was supervised by Khalil al-Baghdadi, who had been trained as a telegraph operator before the British restricted such technical positions to European personnel. Working from a hidden facility beneath a traditional coppersmith's workshop, Khalil and his team of technicians created equipment that could intercept British messages while transmitting resistance communications using frequencies and codes that remained undetected by colonial security services. The facility itself was a masterpiece of concealment and engineering. Located 30 feet beneath street level, accessed through tunnels that connected to the broader network linking Hashish establishments throughout Cairo, it contained sophisticated equipment that had been assembled from components smuggled into Egypt over a period of months. The workshop above provided perfect cover for the technical activities taking place below. The sounds of hammering and metalworking masked the noise of construction and equipment operation. The constant flow of customers and suppliers created opportunities for personnel and materials to move in and out without attracting attention. The traditional nature of the business made British officials unlikely to investigate its activities closely. But the most ingenious aspect of the facility was how it had been integrated into the legitimate copperworking operations above. The same electrical principles used for telegraph equipment were also essential for certain metalworking techniques, so the presence of electrical apparatus in the building was perfectly normal and explainable. Khalil's team had developed procedures that allowed them to switch rapidly between legitimate copperwork and clandestine communications activities. If British authorities arrived for an inspection, sophisticated equipment could be hidden, while traditional metalworking tools took their place within minutes. The electrical connections needed for telegraph interception could be disguised as lighting systems for the workshop. The intelligence gathered through this communications network proved invaluable for resistance planning. Advance warning of British security operations allowed resistance members to avoid capture or prepare countermeasures. Information about colonial economic policies enabled the movement to develop effective strategies for economic warfare. Details about British military capabilities and deployment plans informed strategic decisions about when and where to escalate resistance activities. But the communications network also served offensive purposes. False messages could be inserted into British telegraph traffic to create confusion and misdirect colonial responses to resistance activities. Authentic British messages could be delayed or rerouted to disrupt colonial operations. Most importantly, the network allowed resistance leaders throughout Egypt to coordinate their activities with unprecedented precision and security. The success of the communications project demonstrated the extraordinary technical capabilities that colonial authorities consistently underestimated in their Egyptian subjects. British officials assumed that sophisticated technical work was beyond native capabilities, making them vulnerable to technical attacks they never anticipated. This technological sophistication was matched by equally impressive developments in other areas of resistance operations. The weapons manufacturing capabilities centered in Hashish establishments had evolved to produce firearms and explosives that rivaled anything available to British forces. The financial networks had developed sufficient resources to purchase modern military equipment from international suppliers. The intelligence operations had achieved penetration of colonial institutions at every level. By 1886, the resistance movement had effectively created a shadow state that possessed many of the capabilities of legitimate governments while remaining completely invisible to the colonial authorities it was preparing to overthrow. The Hashish establishments that had begun as simple refuges for displaced men had evolved into the institutional foundation of an alternative Egyptian civilization. But this remarkable achievement carried enormous risks. The more sophisticated and effective the resistance movement became, the more dangerous it was for the ordinary Egyptians who comprised its membership. Discovery meant not just imprisonment, but often death, and the consequences extended to families and communities that had supported resistance activities. Fatima bint Omar understood these risks intimately. As the wife of Muhammad al-Ghazawi, the carpenter whose story began our journey into Cairo's hidden world, she had watched her husband transform from a frustrated artisan into a committed revolutionary. She supported his involvement in the resistance movement, but she also lived daily with the fear that he might not return from his evening gatherings. Fatima's experience revealed another dimension of the Hashish establishment's social impact. While these spaces were exclusively male, their influence extended throughout Egyptian society through the families and communities connected to their members. Women like Fatima developed their own networks for supporting resistance activities, providing safe houses, gathering intelligence, and maintaining communications when their men were away on dangerous operations. The women's networks operated according to different principles than the male establishments, but they served equally important functions in sustaining the resistance movement. Traditional female social activities like wedding preparations, religious festivals, and neighborhood visits became opportunities for coordinating support activities and sharing information vital to resistance operations. Fatima had become a central figure in these women's networks, using her skills as a seamstress to create clothing that concealed weapons and documents. Her workshops served as a meeting place where women could discuss resistance activities while engaging in apparently innocent domestic tasks. Her connections throughout the neighborhood provided early warning systems that protected male family members from surprise raids by colonial authorities. But Fatima's most important contribution was emotional and psychological support for men whose resistance activities subjected them to extraordinary stress. The double life required by underground work created psychological pressures that could destroy even the strongest individuals if they lacked adequate support systems. The hashish that helped men cope with these pressures during their evening gatherings needed to be supplemented by family support that sustained them through the daylight hours when they maintained their cover identities. Women like Fatima provided this support through their understanding, encouragement, and practical assistance that made resistance activities possible. The family dimension of resistance work also created additional vulnerabilities that required careful management. Children needed to be protected from knowledge that could compromise their father's activities while being prepared to survive if those fathers were captured or killed. Wives needed to maintain normal social relationships with neighbors while concealing their family's involvement in anti-colonial activities. These challenges were addressed through community support systems that extended far beyond the hashish establishments themselves. Traditional Egyptian social institutions like extended families, neighborhood associations, and religious communities were gradually adapted to serve resistance functions while maintaining their normal appearances. The mosque where Fatima and her neighbors gathered for religious observances also served as a communication center where information vital to resistance operations was transmitted through seemingly innocent conversations about family news and community events. The traditional women's gathering, where they prepared food for religious festivals, became opportunities for coordinating logistical support for resistance activities. But the most important function of these extended support networks was maintaining the cultural and spiritual foundations that gave meaning to resistance activities. Men who risked their lives in underground operations needed to believe that their sacrifices were preserving something valuable for future generations. The family and community networks provided tangible connections to the Egyptian culture and identity they were fighting to protect. This cultural preservation work was particularly important because British colonial policies were systematically attacking traditional Egyptian institutions and replacing them with European alternatives. The resistance movement wasn't just fighting for political independence, it was fighting for cultural survival in the face of comprehensive colonial transformation. The Hashish establishment served as centers for this cultural resistance, preserving traditional Egyptian practices that were being eliminated from public life. The music, poetry, storytelling, and ritual observances that took place in these spaces maintained cultural traditions that might otherwise have disappeared under colonial pressure. But this cultural work wasn't simply preservationist, it was creative and adaptive. The men who gathered in these establishments weren't just repeating ancient practices. They were developing new forms of Egyptian culture that incorporated contemporary experiences while maintaining connections to traditional foundations. The poetry created in these spaces, for example, combined classical Arabic literary forms with contemporary political content in ways that created distinctly modern expressions of Egyptian identity. The music evolved to include new instruments and styles while preserving traditional rhythms and melodic structures. The storytelling traditions adapted ancient narrative patterns to contemporary resistance themes. This cultural creativity was essential to the resistance movement's psychological effectiveness. Men needed to believe that they were fighting not just against colonial oppression, but for a positive vision of Egyptian independence that would create something better than what existed before the occupation. The Hashish enhanced altered consciousness that facilitated these cultural activities wasn't just providing temporary escape from colonial reality, it was enabling the psychological and spiritual work necessary for creating alternative visions of Egyptian possibility. The sweet smoke that filled these chambers each evening carried the dreams and aspirations that would eventually transform occupied Egypt into an independent nation. But as the resistance movement grew more sophisticated and effective, it also attracted more attention from British security services that were beginning to recognize the threats posed by Egyptian underground activities. The comfortable illusion that native subjects were incapable of organized resistance was gradually being shattered by a series of successful operations that demonstrated capabilities colonial authorities had never imagined possible. The challenge facing resistance leaders by the late 1880s was how to continue expanding their operations while maintaining the security that had protected them from detection. The same success that validated their methods also made them more vulnerable to discovery and beginning to take Egyptian resistance seriously. This ration by colonial forces that were finally tension between growth and security would ultimately determine whether the extraordinary social experiment represented by Cairo's Hashish establishments could survive long enough to achieve its ultimate goal of Egyptian independence, or whether it would be crushed by colonial authorities who had finally smoke-filled chambers hidden beneath their feet, awakened to the sophisticated threat developing in the hour. The morning of March 15, 1887, brought news that would forever change the delicate balance between the resistance networks and their colonial hunters. Yusuf al-Andalusi was grinding fresh coffee beans in his small shop near the Khan el-Khalili when a breathless messenger appeared at his doorway. The boy, no more than 12 years old, delivered his message in the coded language that had become second nature to Cairo's underground networks. The coffee merchant needs to know that the morning shipment from Alexandria has been delayed indefinitely. 3 warehouses have been sealed by customs officials, and several suppliers will not be available for future business. Yusuf's hands never paused in their grinding, but his mind immediately translated the coded message into its terrifying reality. British forces had raided 3 hashish establishments during the night. Several key resistance members had been arrested, and the security of the entire network was now compromised in ways that could prove catastrophic. The raids themselves had been surgical in their precision, suggesting that British intelligence had finally penetrated the resistance networks with devastating effectiveness. The House of Clouds, which had served as Ahmad ibn Tulun's introduction to the underground world, had been completely destroyed. Purs had been sealed in the workshop of Whist. Its master craftsman, Mahmud ibn Hakim, was missing, presumably arrested or killed. Most alarming of all, the Archive of Sorrows had been discovered and ransacked, meaning that years of carefully accumulated intelligence and biographical records were now in British hands. Yusuf closed his shop immediately and began the dangerous journey through back alleys and tunnel networks to reach the emergency gathering point that had been established for exactly this type of crisis. The route took him through parts of old Cairo that most residents never saw, hidden passages that connected medieval buildings in ways that created a secret geography known only to resistance members. As he moved through these concealed corridors, Yusuf encountered other men making the same desperate journey. Their faces reflected the mixture of fear and determination that characterized resistance members who understood that their world was collapsing around them but refused to abandon their commitment to Egyptian independence. The emergency gathering took place in a chamber beneath the mosque of Ibn Tulun that had been prepared years earlier for exactly this contingency. The space was smaller than the elaborate establishments that had been destroyed, but it contained everything necessary for the surviving leadership to assess their situation and plan their response to the British offensive. Mahmud Bey al-Falaki had survived the night's raids, but his appearance shocked the men who gathered around him in the cramped underground chamber. The elderly administrator, who had once carried himself with the dignity of his former position, now looked like a man who had aged decades in a single night. His hands shook as he prepared the water pipe that would help calm his nerves sufficiently to address the crisis facing his surviving followers. The intelligence that had made the raids possible had come from within the resistance networks themselves. Someone with access to the most sensitive information about establishment locations, security procedures, and membership lists had provided British authorities with everything they needed to strike at the heart of the movement. The betrayal wasn't simply a matter of one man's treachery. It represented a fundamental compromise of the security systems that had protected the resistance for nearly 5 years. Captain Morrison, whose earlier attempts at infiltration had been so thoroughly defeated by resistance counterintelligence, had finally achieved his objective through patience and systematic corruption, rather than clever disguise. Over months of careful investigation, he had identified Egyptians whose personal circumstances made them vulnerable to recruitment as informers. Salim al-Baghdadi, the former court clerk who had served as Ahmad's guide through the underground tunnel system, had been Morrison's most valuable source. Financial pressures created by his mother's medical expenses had made Salim desperate for the substantial payments that British intelligence offered for information about resistance activities. His access to multiple establishments and his trusted status within the networks had allowed him to provide Morrison with detailed intelligence about the movement's structure and operations. But Salim's betrayal went beyond simple information sharing. He had actively facilitated British penetration of resistance security by identifying weaknesses in establishment procedures and suggesting ways that raids could be conducted with maximum effectiveness. His insider knowledge had allowed British forces to strike simultaneously at multiple locations before resistance members could warn each other or implement emergency dispersal procedures. The psychological impact of this betrayal extended far beyond the immediate operational damage. Men who had trusted each other with their lives now found themselves questioning the loyalty of longtime comrades. The sense of brotherhood that had sustained the resistance through years of dangerous operations was shattered by the knowledge that someone they had considered family had sold them to their enemies. Mahmoud attempted to address these concerns as the surviving leadership gathered in their emergency refuge, but his words carried little conviction. How could they rebuild trust when they had no way of knowing whether other informers remained active within their ranks? How could they resume operations when their security procedures had proven inadequate against British intelligence techniques? How could they maintain hope when their most important resources had been destroyed or compromised? The hashish they shared that night tasted different from the sweet smoke that had filled their regular gathering places. Mixed with fear and uncertainty, it provided little of the psychological relief that had made their previous sessions so valuable for resistance planning. Instead of opening their minds to creative possibilities, the drug seemed to intensify their awareness of how desperate their situation had become. Ahmad ibn Tulun spoke for many of the men when he suggested that they should consider suspending resistance activities until they could develop new security procedures and rebuild their networks. The risks of continuing operations with compromised security seemed to outweigh any potential benefits they might achieve through continued resistance. But this counsel of caution was challenged by younger members who argued that suspension would hand the British a victory they had not fully earned. Omar ibn Khalil, the former dye worker whose anger had been channeled into effective resistance operations, spoke passionately about the obligation they owed to the martyrs whose sacrifice had built the movement they were now considering abandoning. The debate that followed revealed fundamental divisions within the resistance community about how to respond to the crisis facing them. Conservative voices argued for preservation of remaining resources through careful withdrawal from active operations. Radical voices demanded immediate escalation of resistance activities to demonstrate that the movement could not be destroyed by British repression. Between these extremes, a third position emerged that would ultimately determine the future direction of Egyptian resistance. Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, the spiritual guide whose hashish-enhanced mystical practices had provided strategic insights for the movement, proposed a fundamental transformation of resistance methods rather than either suspension or escalation of existing approaches. The Sheikh argued that the British success in penetrating their networks demonstrated the limitations of the institutional approach that had characterized resistance activities since the early days of the occupation. The elaborate establishments, formal hierarchies, and complex security procedures that had initially protected the movement had eventually become vulnerabilities that skilled intelligence operatives could exploit. Instead of trying to rebuild these vulnerable institutions, the Sheikh proposed a return to the spiritual foundations that had originally inspired Egyptian resistance to foreign occupation. Rather than creating new establishments that could be discovered and destroyed, they should focus on developing individual capabilities that could operate independently while remaining connected through shared spiritual practices and cultural commitments. This approach would require abandoning the hashish establishments that had served as the movement's institutional foundation, but it would also eliminate the security vulnerabilities that had made them susceptible to British intelligence operations. Individual resistance members would operate according to principles and methods they had internalized through years of training, but they would no longer depend on regular gatherings or elaborate organizational structures. The transformation would not be easy. Men who had found identity and purpose in the brotherhood of the hashish establishments would need to discover new sources of spiritual and psychological sustenance. The elaborate support systems that had sustained families and communities connected to resistance activities would need to be replaced with more flexible and secure alternatives. But the Sheikh's proposal offered the possibility of creating a resistance movement that was truly invisible to British intelligence, because it existed primarily in the minds and hearts of individual Egyptians, rather than in physical locations that could be discovered and destroyed. This psychological resistance would be more difficult to detect, but potentially more powerful in its effects on both colonial authorities and Egyptian society. The debate continued through the night as men weighed the advantages and risks of this fundamental transformation. Some argued that abandoning the institutional framework would mean losing the collective capabilities that had made their movement effective. Others countered that those capabilities had proven insufficient against sophisticated British intelligence operations and needed to be replaced with approaches that offered better security. As dawn approached, the discussion gradually shifted from theoretical analysis to practical planning. Even those who remained skeptical about the Sheikh's proposal recognized that the old methods had been compromised beyond repair and that some form of transformation was necessary for the movement's survival. The first step would be dispersing the surviving membership throughout Egypt, rather than concentrating them in Cairo, where British surveillance could monitor their activities. Men would return to their home villages or relocate to distant cities, where they could begin establishing new forms of resistance organization adapted to local conditions and opportunities. But this dispersion would not mean abandoning the connections that had made collective action possible. Instead, it would create a distributed network of resistance cells that could coordinate their activities through communication methods that were less vulnerable to British interception. The spiritual practices and cultural commitments that had united men in the Hashish establishments would provide the foundation for maintaining unity across geographical separation. Ahmad ibn Tulun was assigned to establish operations in the Delta region, where his family connections could provide cover for resistance activities. His knowledge of government procedures and his experience with underground organization would be valuable for developing resistance capabilities among the farming communities that formed the backbone of Egyptian society. Omar ibn Khalil would relocate to Alexandria, where his technical skills could be used to disrupt British shipping operations while establishing new recruitment networks among the port workers and craftsmen who had been displaced by colonial economic policies. His transformation from angry individual to disciplined operative made him ideal for training new resistance members who were dealing with similar personal losses. Yusuf al-Andalusi would remain in Cairo but abandon his coffee shop and establish a new identity that would allow him to operate without detection by British authorities who might be monitoring known resistance members. His mathematical and engineering skills would be crucial for maintaining communications between dispersed resistance cells and coordinating activities across the expanded geographical area. The tunnel networks that had connected the Hashish establishments would be sealed to prevent British forces from using them for further intelligence gathering. The weapons, gold, and documents that had been stored in hidden locations throughout the system would be recovered and redistributed to resistance members who were relocating to new areas of operation. But the most important task was preserving the cultural and spiritual traditions that had sustained the resistance movement through years of underground struggle. The poetry, music, storytelling, and ritual practices that had flourished in the Hashish establishments needed to be maintained in forms that could survive without institutional support. This cultural preservation work would be particularly challenging because it required maintaining collective traditions through individual practice. Men who had participated in group sessions where hashish enhanced their appreciation of traditional Egyptian culture would need to find ways of continuing this cultural work in isolation or in much smaller gatherings. The Sheikh provided guidance for this transition by teaching meditation and spiritual practices that could be performed individually while maintaining connections to the broader resistance community. These practices incorporated elements of traditional Islamic mysticism with techniques that had been developed specifically for resistance work. Individual resistance members would use these spiritual practices to maintain their psychological connection to Egyptian identity while operating under cover identities that required them to appear as loyal colonial subjects. The internal spiritual work would provide the psychological foundation for resistance activities while protecting them from the compromising emotional effects of prolonged deception. The hashish that had played such an important role in resistance spiritual practices would continue to be used, but in more carefully controlled circumstances that minimize security risks. Rather than the elaborate group sessions that had characterized the establishments, individual members would use the drug in private settings, where they could engage in the psychological and spiritual work necessary for effective resistance operations. But the transformation from institutional to individual resistance would require more than spiritual preparation. It would demand fundamental changes in operational methods that had been developed over years of collective experience. The intelligence gathering, financial operations, and military activities that had been coordinated through the Hashish establishments would need to be reconceptualized for implementation by individuals or very small groups. Intelligence work would shift from the elaborate networks that had connected multiple establishments to more focused operations conducted by individuals with specific access to valuable information. Rather than trying to gather comprehensive intelligence about all British activities, resistance members would concentrate on collecting information that was directly relevant to their particular operational responsibilities. Financial operations would be simplified and decentralized to eliminate the vulnerabilities that had made the centralized banking systems attractive targets for British intelligence. Individual resistance members would manage their own resources and conduct economic warfare activities through personal business relationships rather than elaborate institutional arrangements. Military activities would focus on sabotage and disruption operations that could be conducted by individuals or small groups without requiring the complex coordination that had characterized some of the movement's previous operations. The goal would be creating cumulative effects through multiple small actions, rather than attempting large-scale operations that required extensive planning and coordination. The transition period would be extraordinarily dangerous, as resistance members relocated and established new operational identities, while British authorities intensified their efforts to exploit the intelligence they had gathered from the destroyed establishments. Many men would be captured or killed during this vulnerable period, when old security systems no longer protected them, but new methods had not yet been fully implemented. Fatima bint Omar faced her own challenges as the transformation affected not just resistance members, but their families and the broader communities that had supported underground activities. The women's networks that had provided logistical and emotional support for the Hashish establishments would need to adapt to serve resistance members who were now dispersed across Egypt and operating under much more restrictive security conditions. The traditional social activities that had provided cover for women's resistance work would continue, but they would need to serve new functions as communication channels for coordinating support activities across much larger geographical areas. Wedding preparations, religious festivals, and family visits would become opportunities for maintaining connections between families whose men were engaged in resistance work in distant locations. But the most difficult challenge for women like Fatima was maintaining family unity when resistance work required men to abandon their communities and establish new identities in unfamiliar locations. Wives and children might not see their husbands and fathers for months or years as operational security demanded complete separation from previous lives and associations. Some families would relocate together, but this was possible only when wives and children could establish legitimate reasons for moving that would not attract British attention. In many cases, families would need to remain separated until resistance operations achieved sufficient success to make reunion possible without compromising security. The emotional costs of this separation were enormous, but they were accepted as necessary sacrifices for the larger goal of Egyptian independence. Women like Fatima understood that their personal losses were part of a broader pattern of sacrifice that characterized the entire resistance movement. The children who grew up during this period would carry the psychological effects of the resistance transformation throughout their lives. Many would have only fragmentary memories of fathers who disappeared when British raids destroyed the world of the Hashish establishments. Others would grow up with new identities in unfamiliar locations, learning to think of themselves as different people than they had been before the crisis that scattered the resistance networks. But these children would also inherit a legacy of resistance that had been tested by the most severe challenges and proven capable of adapting to survive. The cultural traditions that had been preserved and transformed in the Hashish establishments would be passed to the next generation through family practices that maintained connections to Egyptian identity, despite the disruptions caused by colonial oppression. The stories, songs, and customs that had flourished in the smoke-filled chambers would survive in the memories of men who carried them to new locations throughout Egypt. These cultural resources would provide foundations for new forms of resistance organization that could emerge when circumstances became favorable for renewed collective action. The transformation of Egyptian resistance from institutional to individual organization represented more than a tactical adaptation to British intelligence successes. It reflected a fundamental evolution in how colonized people could maintain their dignity and pursue their independence under conditions of systematic oppression. The lessons learned through years of underground struggle would inform resistance movements throughout the colonized world, as similar transformations became necessary in response to imperial counterintelligence efforts. But the immediate concern for the men who gathered in the emergency chamber beneath the mosque of Ibn Tulun was survival. They needed to complete their dispersion and establish new operational identities before British authorities could exploit their intelligence advantages to destroy the remaining resistance capabilities. The final Hashish session in the emergency chamber was unlike any that had preceded it. The sweet smoke carried the weight of endings rather than the promise of new possibilities. Men who had shared pipes and dreams for years understood that they were participating in the conclusion of one phase of Egyptian resistance and the uncertain beginning of another. As they passed the water pipe for the last time, each man carried in his lungs not just the familiar drug that had facilitated so many important conversations, but also the essence of a community that had created something unprecedented in the history of colonial resistance. The Hashish establishments had demonstrated that oppressed people could build parallel institutions that provided alternatives to every aspect of colonial control, while remaining invisible to the authorities they were designed to overthrow. The failure of those institutions to survive British intelligence penetration did not diminish their historical 5 years. Ordinary Egyptians had created significance. Fernlid and maintained a shadow society that functioned more effectively than the official systems imposed by their colonizers. They had developed economic networks that undermined colonial extraction, educational programs that preserved Egyptian culture, military capabilities that threatened British security, and spiritual practices that sustained hope for independence. Most importantly, they had proven that the colonial narrative of native incapacity was fundamentally false. The men who had gathered in the Hashish establishments possessed intellectual, organizational, and creative capabilities that rivaled those of their European occupiers. Their eventual defeat by British intelligence represented superior resources and systematic advantages, rather than inherent limitations in Egyptian capabilities. The legacy of the Hashish establishments would survive the destruction of their physical locations and the dispersion of their membership. The methods they had developed, the cultural traditions they had preserved, and the spirit of resistance they had embodied would continue to influence Egyptian opposition to colonial rule through subsequent decades. Individual resistance members would carry these influences to new locations throughout Egypt and beyond, creating networks of connection that transcended geographical boundaries and institutional structures. The smoke that had filled the chambers of old Cairo would dissipate, but the dreams and aspirations it had carried would continue to sustain Egyptian hopes for independence. As the final session concluded, and the men prepared to begin their dangerous journeys to new lives and new forms of resistance, they understood that they were participating in a transformation that extended far beyond their personal circumstances. The Hashish havens that had provided refuge from colonial oppression were ending, but the vision of Egyptian independence they had nurtured would continue to inspire future generations of freedom fighters. The sweet smoke that had once curled through the hidden chambers of 19th century Cairo would never again bring together the same community of desperate men seeking dignity in an occupied homeland. But the essential spirit that had animated those gatherings, the refusal to accept defeat and the determination to preserve Egyptian identity despite systematic colonial pressure, would survive to fight another day under different circumstances and through different methods. The story of Cairo's Hashish establishments was concluding, but the larger story of Egyptian resistance to foreign domination was entering a new chapter that would ultimately lead to the independence their founders had dreamed of achieving through different means and in a different time. The morning light filtering through the mashrabia screens of old Cairo cast geometric shadows across cobblestone streets still damp with dew. But in the hidden chambers beneath, where no natural light had penetrated for hours, the last embers of hashish pipes glowed like dying stars in the darkness. The men who had once filled these spaces with their dreams and desperate schemes were now scattered to the winds, leaving behind only the lingering scent of their sacred smoke and the whispered echoes of their revolutionary prayers. Yet even as the great network of establishments crumbled under British pressure, new forms of resistance were already taking root in the fertile soil of Egyptian determination. The transformation that Sheikh Mohammed al-Ghazali had envisioned was not merely a retreat from institutional organization, but an evolution towards something far more dangerous to colonial control. A resistance that lived in the hearts and minds of individual Egyptians, invisible to surveillance, immune to raids, and impossible to destroy through conventional counterintelligence methods. In the weeks following the emergency gathering beneath the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, the men who had once shared pipes in the House of Clouds began to discover what their movement could become when freed from the constraints of physical locations and formal hierarchies. The hashish they had once consumed in elaborate group rituals became a private sacrament that connected them to their mission, even in complete isolation from their former comrades. Khalil ibn Rashid found himself 300 miles south of Cairo, working as a grain merchant in a Nile Valley village, where no one suspected that the quiet man who weighed wheat and barley had once helped plan operations that struck terror into British administrative offices. His new identity was perfect in its mundane simplicity, but beneath the surface of his daily routines, Khalil was conducting a form of resistance that was far more sophisticated than anything he had attempted in the elaborate establishments of old Cairo. The village where Khalil had established himself was typical of thousands throughout Egypt, a farming community where traditional life continued much as it had for centuries despite the colonial administration's attempts to modernize and control every aspect of Egyptian society. The farmers who brought their grain to Khalil's scales spoke in the same dialects their ancestors had used, practiced the same agricultural techniques, and maintained the same social customs that had sustained Egyptian civilization through previous foreign occupations. But Khalil recognized something that British administrators consistently failed to understand. These apparently backward farming communities possessed organizational capabilities and cultural resources that could be transformed into powerful weapons against colonial rule. The traditional systems that governed village life, the customary practices that regulated economic relationships, and the informal networks that connected rural communities throughout the Nile Valley represented a parallel Egyptian civilization that had survived every attempt at foreign control. During his first months in the village, Khalil devoted himself to understanding these traditional systems and identifying ways they could be adapted to serve resistance purposes. He spent his evenings visiting with farmers and their families, sharing tea and conversation, while carefully observing how decisions were made, how information flowed, and how the community responded to challenges and opportunities. What he discovered exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The village possessed communication networks that connected it to dozens of other farming communities throughout the region. These networks operated through traditional social practices like seasonal festivals, family visits, and religious pilgrimages that brought people together from widely separated locations. Information traveled through these networks with remarkable speed and accuracy, often reaching distant villages before official government communications arrived through colonial administrative channels. The economic relationships that governed village life were equally sophisticated. Farmers maintained complex systems for sharing resources coordinating labor, and managing risk that operated entirely outside the colonial monetary system. These traditional economic practices provided models for creating alternative financial networks that could support resistance activities while remaining invisible to British oversight. But most importantly, Khalil discovered that the village possessed leadership structures and decision-making processes that had been refined over generations of dealing with external threats and internal challenges. The men who guided community decisions were not formally appointed officials who could be identified and corrupted by colonial authorities, but respected individuals whose influence derived from their wisdom, integrity, and commitment to traditional Egyptian values. These informal leaders were precisely the people Khalil needed to recruit for resistance activities. They possessed the trust and respect necessary to coordinate collective action, the knowledge and experience needed to assess risks and opportunities, and the cultural authority required to justify resistance as consistent with traditional Egyptian values and Islamic teachings. The recruitment process required extraordinary patience and psychological insight. Khalil could not simply appear in the village and announce his intentions without risking exposure that could destroy both his own mission and the community he hoped to organize. Instead, he needed to establish himself as a trusted member of the village community before gradually introducing ideas and opportunities that would lead others to discover resistance possibilities for themselves. The process began with Khalil's grain merchant business, which provided natural opportunities for building relationships throughout the community. Every farmer who brought grain to his scales represented a potential conversation about economic conditions, government policies, and the challenges facing traditional Egyptian agriculture under colonial rule. These conversations allowed Khalil to identify individuals whose personal experiences and political attitudes made them suitable for resistance recruitment. Hassan Abu Ahmad was exactly the type of person Khalil was seeking. A middle-aged farmer whose family had worked the same fields for 8 generations, Hassan possessed deep knowledge of traditional agricultural practices and strong connections throughout the rural community. But British policies that favoured cotton production for export had forced Hassan to abandon food crops that his family had grown for centuries, leaving him economically vulnerable and culturally displaced. During their conversations over grain transactions, Hassan expressed frustration with colonial policies in terms that revealed both political awareness and emotional commitment to traditional Egyptian values. He understood that British economic policies were designed to extract wealth from Egypt rather than serve Egyptian interests, and he resented the cultural changes that colonial modernization was imposing on village life. But Hassan's most valuable quality from Khalil's perspective was his reputation for reliability and discretion. Other villagers trusted Hassan with their most sensitive concerns because they knew he would never betray confidences or act impulsively in ways that could harm the community. This trustworthiness made Hassan an ideal candidate for resistance recruitment because he could be trusted with dangerous information while possessing the social connections necessary for recruiting others. The recruitment process extended over several months as Khalil gradually introduced Hassan to ideas and possibilities that prepared him for eventual involvement in resistance activities. Their conversations moved slowly from general complaints about colonial policies to specific analysis of British vulnerabilities, from abstract discussions of Egyptian rights to concrete planning for resistance actions. The breakthrough came when Khalil shared hashish with Hassan during a private evening gathering in the grain merchant's simple quarters above his shop. The drug served the same functions it had performed in the elaborate establishments of Old Cairo, creating psychological conditions that facilitated honest communication and strategic thinking, while building bonds of trust and shared commitment. As the sweet smoke filled the small room, Hassan found himself expressing thoughts and feelings that he had never shared with anyone. The daily humiliations of colonial life, the anger at seeing traditional ways dismissed as primitive superstition, the dreams of Egyptian independence that he had hardly dared to acknowledge even to himself, all emerged in the honest conversation that hashish made possible. But more importantly, the altered consciousness produced by the drug allowed Hassan to envision possibilities that had previously seemed impossible. Under the influence of hashish, he could imagine scenarios where village-level resistance activities might actually contribute to broader Egyptian independence movements. He could see how traditional community organization could be adapted to serve revolutionary purposes. He could believe that ordinary farmers like himself possessed capabilities that could threaten colonial control. By the end of that evening, Hassan had committed himself to resistance work with an enthusiasm that exceeded Khalil's expectations. But his commitment was based on a clear understanding of what resistance would require and a realistic assessment of the risks involved. The hashish had not impaired his judgment, but had enhanced his ability to think strategically about possibilities that sobriety made difficult to contemplate. Hassan's recruitment marked the beginning of a new phase in Khalil's mission. With a trusted local partner who possessed extensive community connections, he could begin the process of building a resistance network that drew on traditional village organization while serving contemporary revolutionary purposes. The network would need to remain completely invisible to British authorities while developing capabilities that could contribute meaningfully to the broader struggle for Egyptian independence. The process required adapting the organizational methods that had proven successful in Cairo's hashish establishments to the different conditions and opportunities present in rural Egyptian communities. The formal hierarchies and elaborate security procedures that had characterized urban resistance networks would be replaced by more flexible and informal arrangements that built on traditional village social structures. The recruitment of additional network members proceeded through the same careful process that Khalil had used with Hassan. Potential candidates were identified through observation of their behavior in community settings, approached gradually through normal social interactions, and evaluated for their trustworthiness and commitment before being invited to participate in private hashish sessions where serious resistance discussions could take place. Within 6 months, Khalil and Hassan had assembled a core group of 12 men whose collective capabilities provided everything necessary for effective rural resistance operations. The group included farmers with detailed knowledge of local geography and seasonal patterns, craftsmen with technical skills that could be adapted for weapons manufacturing and communications work, merchants with connections to other villages and access to transportation networks, and religious leaders whose authority could provide spiritual justification for resistance activities. But the most remarkable aspect of this rural network was how it had integrated resistance activities with traditional village life in ways that made detection nearly impossible. The men who gathered for evening hashish sessions appeared to be engaging in normal social practices that had characterized Egyptian village life for centuries. Their discussions of resistance strategies were indistinguishable from traditional consultations about community problems and opportunities. The hashish they consumed was grown in small plots hidden among legitimate crops throughout the region, using traditional cultivation methods that aroused no suspicion from colonial agricultural inspectors. The pipes they shared had been crafted by local artisans using designs and techniques that dated back generations, making them appear to be normal cultural artifacts rather than tools for revolutionary organizing. Even the timing and location of their gatherings followed patterns established by traditional village social customs. The men met during hours when similar groups throughout Egypt gathered for conversation and companionship in settings that were consistent with normal community activities. Their behavior during these sessions conformed to expectations about how Egyptian men conducted themselves in traditional social situations. But beneath this carefully maintained appearance of normalcy, the rural resistance network was developing capabilities that posed serious threats to colonial control throughout the region. The intelligence they gathered about British activities was more comprehensive and accurate than anything colonial authorities possessed about Egyptian rural communities. Their economic warfare activities were systematically undermining colonial policies designed to extract agricultural wealth from the Nile Valley. Their recruitment efforts were creating additional networks in villages throughout the region. Most importantly, They were demonstrating that resistance to colonial rule could be conducted by ordinary Egyptians using traditional resources and methods, rather than requiring the elaborate institutional structures that British intelligence had learned to detect and destroy. The rural networks represented a form of resistance that was truly indigenous to Egyptian society and therefore far more difficult for foreign authorities to comprehend or counter. The success of Khalil's rural operations was matched by similar developments in other locations, where former Hashish establishment members had relocated and begun building new forms of resistance organization. In Alexandria, Omar ibn Khalil had established networks among dock workers and sailors whose access to international shipping provided opportunities for intelligence gathering and sabotage activities that extended far beyond Egyptian borders. Omar's recruitment methods adapted the psychological techniques that had proven successful in Cairo's Hashish establishments to the different cultural conditions present in Egypt's primary Mediterranean port. The men he recruited were already accustomed to the cosmopolitan influences that came with working in international commerce, making them more receptive to political ideas and organizational methods that drew on experiences from throughout the colonial world. The hashish sessions that Omar organized took place in waterfront locations where such gatherings were normal parts of maritime culture. Sailors and dock workers from throughout the Eastern Mediterranean had long traditions of sharing drugs and stories during their brief stays in foreign ports, making hashish consumption an unremarkable activity that attracted no attention from colonial security services. But these apparently normal social gatherings served the same resistance functions that had characterized the elaborate establishments of old Cairo. Men shared intelligence about British shipping activities, coordinated sabotage operations against colonial economic interests, and planned recruitment activities that would extend their networks to other Mediterranean ports. Omar's most successful innovation was developing methods for using international shipping to create resistance connections between Egyptian networks and anti-colonial movements throughout the region. Egyptian operatives could travel to other ports as crew members on merchant vessels, carrying messages and resources that supported resistance activities in multiple countries, while gathering intelligence about British operations throughout their empire. These international connections provided Egyptian resistance with access to weapons, funding, and expertise that would have been impossible to obtain through purely domestic resources. But more importantly, they created psychological benefits by demonstrating that Egyptian resistance was part of a broader anti-colonial movement that was challenging European imperialism throughout the colonized world. The men who participated in Omar's networks drew strength and inspiration from knowing that their sacrifices were contributing to struggles for independence that extended far beyond Egyptian borders. The hashish they shared carried dreams of liberation that encompassed not just their own homeland, but the entire colonized world that was beginning to challenge European domination. In Upper Egypt, Yusuf al-Andalusi had established operations that drew on the region's unique cultural and geographical characteristics to create forms of resistance that were particularly difficult for British authorities to detect or counter. The communities along the Upper Nile possessed traditions of independence and self-governance that had survived previous foreign occupations, providing cultural foundations for contemporary resistance activities. Yusuf's mathematical and engineering background proved invaluable for developing technical capabilities that rural communities needed for effective resistance operations. He established workshops that appeared to be traditional craft operations but actually produced weapons, communication equipment, and other materials necessary for resistance activities. But his most important contribution was developing educational programs that preserved and transmitted traditional Egyptian knowledge, while preparing young men for resistance work. These programs combined traditional Islamic scholarship with practical training in technical skills, creating a generation of rural Egyptians who possessed both cultural grounding and practical capabilities necessary for effective anti-colonial action. The hashish sessions that accompanied these educational activities served multiple functions that went beyond simple intoxication. The drug enhanced students' ability to absorb and integrate complex information while creating psychological conditions that facilitated the spiritual and cultural transformation necessary for effective resistance work. Young men who participated in these sessions learned to see themselves as heirs to centuries of Egyptian civilization rather than subjects of colonial rule. They developed pride in traditional knowledge and methods that colonial education dismissed as primitive superstition. They acquired confidence in their own capabilities and commitment to using those capabilities in service of Egyptian independence. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to maintain their cultural identity and political commitments while operating within colonial systems that demanded conformity and submission. The psychological techniques they mastered during Hashish-enhanced educational sessions provided tools for preserving their dignity and effectiveness while appearing to conform to colonial expectations. By 1888, these dispersed networks had evolved into a form of resistance that was far more dangerous to British colonial control than the centralized institutions that had been destroyed during the raids of the previous year. The new resistance was truly invisible because it existed primarily in the consciousness of individual Egyptians, rather than in physical locations that could be discovered and attacked. The transformation had eliminated the security vulnerabilities that had made the Hashish establishment susceptible to British intelligence penetration, but it had also preserved the essential capabilities that had made those institutions effective. Intelligence continued to flow through networks that connected resistance members throughout Egypt and beyond. Economic warfare continued to undermine colonial extraction policies. Military capabilities continued to develop through training programs and weapons production activities. But the most profound change was psychological and cultural. The resistance had evolved from an institutional movement that provided alternatives to colonial systems into a spiritual and cultural transformation that changed how Egyptians understood themselves and their relationship to foreign rule. The hashish that had once been consumed in elaborate group rituals had become a personal sacrament that connected individual resistance members to their mission and their cultural identity. This individual spiritual practice was sustained by cultural traditions that had been preserved and adapted through years of resistance activity. The stories, songs, and customs that had flourished in the smoke-filled chambers of old Cairo continued to provide meaning and inspiration for resistance members who now carried these traditions in their hearts, rather than gathering to share them in communal settings. The poetry that had once been recited in hashish establishments was now composed and memorized by individual resistance members who used verses to encode and transmit strategic information while preserving cultural expressions of Egyptian identity and resistance. The music that had accompanied group hashish sessions was now performed by individual musicians who carried traditional melodies and rhythms to new locations, where they inspired additional recruitment and cultural preservation activities. The storytelling traditions that had provided both entertainment and strategic communication in the establishments were now practiced by individual resistance members who used narrative techniques to share information and coordinate activities while maintaining the cultural frameworks that gave meaning to their struggle. But the most important cultural preservation work involved the spiritual practices that had been developed during years of hashish-enhanced mystical experiences in the establishments. These practices provided individual resistance members with access to the altered states of consciousness that enhanced their effectiveness while and spiritual connection, sustaining their psychological to the broader resistance community. The meditation techniques that Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali had taught in the Temple of Dreams were now practiced by resistance members throughout Egypt and beyond, creating a network of spiritual connection, ended geographical boundaries, and organizational structures. Individual resistance members could use these techniques to achieve states of heightened awareness and strategic insight that guided their operational decisions, while maintaining their psychological equilibrium under the stress of dangerous underground work. The hashish that facilitated these individual spiritual practices served the same functions it had performed in group settings, but with enhanced security and flexibility that made detection nearly impossible. Resistance members could engage in their spiritual work in complete privacy, using drug-enhanced meditation to plan operations, analyze intelligence, and maintain their commitment to the cause without requiring gatherings or communications that might attract British attention. This transformation of resistance from institutional to individual organization represented more than a tactical adaptation to British counterintelligence success. It reflected a fundamental evolution in how colonized peoples could maintain their dignity and pursue their independence under conditions of systematic oppression. The lessons learned through years of underground struggle in Cairo's Hashish establishments had produced methods and insights that would influence resistance movements throughout the colonized world as similar transformations became necessary in response to imperial surveillance and repression. The sweet smoke that had once filled the hidden chambers of 19th century Cairo had dissipated, but the dreams and aspirations it had carried continued to sustain Egyptian hopes for independence through new forms and in new locations. The Hashish havens that had provided refuge from colonial oppression were gone, but the essential spirit that had animated those gatherings lived on in the hearts and minds of the men who had been transformed by their experiences in those sacred spaces. Individual resistance members who had once gathered in elaborate establishments to share pipes and revolutionary dreams now carried those dreams within themselves as they moved through Egyptian society, appearing to be ordinary subjects of colonial rule while actually serving as agents of liberation who worked tirelessly for the independence their movement had always sought to achieve. The transformation was complete, but the struggle continued through different methods and in different forms, sustained by the cultural traditions and spiritual practices that had been forged in the smoke-filled chambers where desperate men had once gathered to preserve their dignity and plan their liberation from foreign domination. The story of Cairo's Hashish havens didn't end with those final wisps of smoke drifting through abandoned chambers. It evolved, adapted, survived. The men who once gathered in the House of Clouds and the Garden of Sorrows had learned something profound about resistance that would echo through generations. Sometimes the most powerful revolution happens not in grand gestures or elaborate institutions, but in the quiet transformation of individual hearts and minds. By 1922, Egypt had achieved the independence that Muhammad al-Ghazawi and Ahmad ibn Tulun had dreamed of during those long nights of shared pipes and whispered plans. The methods had changed, the faces were different, but the spirit that had animated those smoke-filled chambers lived on. The Hashish establishments had taught an entire generation that dignity could not be destroyed by foreign occupation, that culture could survive in the most hidden spaces, and that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capabilities when they refused to accept defeat. Today, as you walk through the narrow alleyways of old Cairo, past weathered doors and ancient mashrabiyah screens, remember that beneath your feet lie the foundations of something remarkable. Those forgotten chambers, where desperate men once gathered to preserve their humanity in the face of systematic oppression, became the invisible seedbed of a nation's rebirth. The sweet smoke that once curled through hidden passages carried more than just temporary escape from colonial reality. It carried the dreams of freedom that would eventually transform an occupied territory into a sovereign nation. The Hashish havens of 19th century Cairo remind us that resistance takes many forms, that sometimes the most subversive act is simply refusing to let your oppressors define who you are. In those smoke-filled rooms, Egyptian men didn't just survive colonial rule, they transcended it, creating spaces where their true selves could flourish, even as they appeared defeated to the outside world. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1875, when the sun first set on those secret gatherings that changed the course of Egyptian history forever.